and welcome back. So, I've been wanting to talk about the intergenerational dynamics of narcissistic abuse, and so I thought a good starting point for that would be talking about narcissistic grandparents. So, for this video, I'm going to focus only on the narcissistic grandmother, and then I will do another video on grandfathers because there are sometimes, just like the mothers and the fathers, some more specific, maybe gender specific traits that can take place. So, if we're going to talk now about the narcissistic grandmother, we could see it as the family matriarch, the one who kind of set the tone. Now, that being said, we don't know how far back this goes. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So chances are, as narcissists do not create themselves, no one is born a narcissist, is something that is created. That narcissistic grandmother also probably had at least one narcissistic parent, or at least some extreme trauma that took place. So again, how far back does it go? We don't know. However, this is kind of a good, maybe a stand-in or kind of the representation of how this dynamic takes place intergenerationally. If we can start with someone who, if they're not a memory or alive at this time, they are not so distant, because the problem is once we get too far back generationally, it's really hard to sometimes piece that together. Whereas a grandparent, at least we do have that connection in some way that is a little more within a generation or two, if that makes sense. So it's not so much, there isn't as much detective work maybe going on. Again, that's another exercise that can be interesting, is to do a little detective work, and whether it's through stories, whether it's just through putting things together with family dynamics and patterns to see where things happen. And sometimes the intergenerational trauma could be because of certain events that took place, whether it was war, whether it's genocide, something like the Holocaust, or possibly residential schools, or any sort of very cataclysmic, traumatic event that took place in a family, or in a direct or even an indirect way. However, that being said, there's also sometimes other things going on in addition to that, where there's something within the family dynamic as well that takes place where we don't talk about this, let it go, it's not resolved. So even if a big traumatic event did take place in some way, the more of external event, it is the way that it's processed or not processed that can cause that intergenerational trauma. So for example, if somebody is able to maybe talk about it and have that held in some way, most people didn't seek therapy back then, but at the same time, maybe there was some safe way to deal with it, and there were stories being shared, and people can sometimes, they can move on from that in whatever way that looks, and they're not going to necessarily become a narcissist or an abuser. So we're talking about more about the various factors that come into play, and family dynamic and interrelational dynamics are what really is the glue that holds together these traumatic patterns, if that makes sense, this dysfunction that come into play. It's how things are handled or not handled, whether it's through emotional neglect, whether it's through overt or covert abuse. So that being said, the narcissistic grandma presents in different ways. So one of the ways is she could be more of an overt narcissist, where she was mean, she was cruel, she was incredibly abusive. And so that is a little more obvious, where someone can say, oh, wow, my mom grew up with or my father grew up with a really abusive parent. we're not going to even talk about parents right now. We're just going to talk about the parent, and that set the tone for what happened to that person. They could be covert, which is a lot more difficult and is more common in female narcissists, where maybe it was passive aggression, maybe it was the neglect of something, the absence of love, where someone would say, I never, maybe your parent, mother or father says, I never it felt loved, or I never felt like I mattered, or no one ever listened to me, or I was punished for expressing myself or feeling a certain way. Or maybe it was about appearances. There was a certain family appearance, like we all are this, we look like this, we're a happy family, la 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 la. But underneath, it's not. It does not exist. That happy family is a facade. It's fake. It's like those old Hollywood sets, for the westerns, where it looks like a town, but it's just being held up by wooden beams. And if you go to the back, they're just a bunch of wooden boards that you could tip over. So there's no substance to it. It could have been that, I've talked about the Jekyll and Hyde personality, where maybe outwardly the mother was very, or the grandmother was very, seemed kind, seemed like, oh, she was such a wonderful woman. But at home, in the privacy of her own home, she was very different. She could be all those cruel things. So there could be a whole blend of dynamics. So for more kind of information about the dynamics that could have come into play for your own parent, if they grew up with this person, particularly if they're a narcissist, it's that pattern that perpetuated itself down the line. See my video on narcissistic mothers, because that will explain how that parent grew up. However, there's also another dynamic that comes into play with the grandchild and the grandparents. So a narcissistic grandparent might be different with the grandchild. They could treat the grandchild in a kinder way, because this is a little more rare, but it could take place where if they're very covert, it might be that because they don't have the same responsibility for you, it's almost they can afford to be nicer to you. However, again, it's very fake. It's very phony, and there's no substance to it. So underneath, they're really not. I mean, because nice and kindness are not the same thing. So they can come off as very nice, but really they could be saying mean things behind your back. They could be complaining about you. Oh, my grandchild never calls, or they're terrible to me, or whatever, or they're, he's a bum, or she doesn't have a job, or, just saying mean things, but to your face, they're like, oh, hello, sweetie. So it's very fake. They could be nasty to you. They could be overly critical. They could be treating you the same way that they treated their child. They could be withholding love. So the dynamic can be complex, because on the one hand, they can be treating you exactly the way they treated their own child, or there can be that buffer that comes into play where they might treat you differently. But even with grandparents, so the grandma, she might even have her golden grandchild. She might have her scapegoat grandchild. She might have her forgotten or invisible grandchild. So that dynamic can also come into play with the grandchildren. So you can see how complex this whole thing gets. So the thing to keep in mind is if you have a narcissistic parent, that person was also raised by at least one narcissist, if not two. But they definitely had a narcissistic parent. There's no way that they didn't spring from the ground. They didn't come out of the womb as a narcissist. They were created by their own abuse. Now, that being said, that doesn't give them a pass. That doesn't give them the right to treat you the way they treated you. It just gives kind of an explanation, and it gives a family pattern. It gives this dynamic that you can see that goes through generations of. So the thing is, multi-generational trauma takes many forms. And what a lot of people maybe have a misconception about is they think it's only the extreme trauma. They think that it's the stuff like I mentioned earlier, the genocide, the war, and those things in and of themselves are not necessarily going to create a narcissist. Not like, oh, I went through this horrible horrible experience and now I've become this. This isn't quite the way it works. There's all those other, as I've talked about, relational dynamics that come into play. So that being said, I'm not at all saying that just because someone had this extreme trauma in their life, they're going to become a narcissist. I'm talking about the role modeling that takes place, the person who is raised, and either the role modeling or the lack of any modeling, that they grow up without empathy. That's the bottom line. That your parent grew up without empathy, at least from one parent. Now, if they had one parent who was a narcissist and another who's an enabler or was a narcissist, it becomes a little more complicated. However, it doesn't mean that they're still not going to grow up a narcissist. So, and again, this is not saying that every person raised by a narcissist grows up to be a narcissist. Otherwise, you would be a narcissist. So, it's only explaining if you have a narcissistic parent, why they may have also gone that way. So again, I'm going to do another video on the idea of just what creates and like why do people become narcissists? What is that element? What needs, almost like cooking. I always say it's like the recipe. If we had to put together a recipe of let's create a narcissist, like we don't want to do that, but let's say we did, just for an experiment. What would we need? What ingredients? What ingredients would we need to create that? So that being said, I hope this was at least relatively clear in the explanation of where that narcissistic grandma might come into play and how that family dynamic happened and how the way that your parent might have grown up also with their own narcissist and why you might have a problematic relationship with your grandmother. And also the same things apply, the same tools apply, that the gray rock, no contact, limited contact, the same things, right? So those are things I've mentioned in other videos. So I invite you to go watch some of those other videos if you haven't already on those dynamics, because they really do work as well with a narcissistic grandparent, as well as my videos on narcissistic fathers and narcissistic mothers. So stay tuned for more videos. Thanks so much for watching. Keep commenting. I love your comments, any suggestions or anything like that. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, please like, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye.